like to introduce now our second panel. We will begin our second panel, and this is Harvard and slavery. Annette Gordon-Reed will be the moderator for that panel. Annette Gordon-Reed is the Charles Warren Professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School and Professor of History at Harvard. And she won the 2009 Pulitzer Prize and many, many prizes for her book, The Hemingses of Monticello. Annette.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I also would like to say that I was for 5 years the Carol K. Fortsheimer Radcliffe Professor. The term ended last year, and I had to come back to earth, into the real world, and actually do some work. So I'm very, very happy to be here under the auspices of Radcliffe. I'm going to introduce our panelists, distinguished panelists, in order of their presentation. Sven Beckert is the Laird Bell Professor of History at Harvard University and an author of the much-acclaimed book on Slavery and Capitalism, Empire of Cotton, A Global History. Sven has been interested in slavery at Harvard for a number of years and did a research project with students called the Harvard Research Project, Slavery Project. Then we will have Alexandra Rahman, who was a student of Sven's, who did her thesis on slavery and was involved in the Harvard and Slavery Research Project. Dan Coquillette, who is from Boston College and is also now the Charles Warren Visiting Professor of American Legal History at the law school, Harvard Law School. Among other things, Dan is a specialist on the royal family, whose contribution was the seed money for the creation of the Harvard Law School. And finally, we'll have Julian Bonder, an award-winning architect who is active contributor to international debates on slavery, memory, architecture, and art and representation, and will talk to us about architecture and memory at the end of the presentation. So to give you some ground rules, each presenter will speak for about 15 minutes. We will then take a time afterwards to have a conversation among ourselves, but we really want to get questions from you all. You know from the beginning that you write your questions. I will take questions from all of the various audiences here in the overflow room. If you're on Twitter, social media, write your questions and I'll try to get those in as well. So that's the order of the day. So we'll start with Sven.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Annette. It's great to be here. Good afternoon. I'm delighted that so many of you decided to come out here today to join us. And I'm especially delighted at the enormous response that this conference has generated, which I think very much speaks to the urgency of the issues that we're debating here, and perhaps also as a hopeful sign that we are able to confront our histories in new ways. When we've shown ability and willingness to face the darkest moments of our history, I become more hopeful about our future, a future that needs to rest on a full and truthful accounting of our past. I'm personally very much moved by the turnout here today and by the interest that you all have been taking in these matters, not least because the engagement with this history here at Harvard began as a decisively low-key affair. 10 years ago, in 2007, I sat in a small seminar room in the Yard with a very small group of undergraduate students, exactly 4 of them, who had signed up for a seminar taught by a professor who did not know more about the topic of the course than they did. I had been inspired to offer that Harvard and Slavery seminar by President Ruth Simmons' path-breaking work at Brown University, and I was also inspired by my upbringing in Germany, which had taught me that almost anywhere some dark history lurks. It was these students that the work to excavate, it was these students who began the work to excavate the historical connections between Harvard and slavery. And in a very real sense, it is they who have enabled us to meet here today. And I very much want to thank them again for all of their work, and some of them are here right now. So. In the past few hours, we have heard moving testimony about the legacy of slavery at American universities. We've heard about colleges buying and selling enslaved workers, about students bringing their enslaved servants to their campuses, about presidents, faculties, alumni, and donors of these institutions as slaveholders, about how enslaved construction workers built the physical infrastructure of various universities, and how the huge stream of money derived from the slave economy infused institutions of higher learning and enabled them, among other things, to train an elite that legitimated notions of racial difference and enslavement and enforced the institutions that had enabled them. A little more than 260 years ago, it were 3 Harvard University-trained judges who convicted Phyllis, an enslaved worker accused of killing her master, to be burned at the stake just a few hundred yards away from where we are meeting right now. This story and many others are moving, and they are disturbing. We can see that some of our most esteemed educational institutions are also the product of some of the most horrific violence that has ever descended upon any group of people. Yes, we did know that much of the wealth of the American South had been built upon slavery, that its roads, its canals, its plantations, and its cities were the result of the exploitation of millions of African Americans. But today at this conference, we learned that the centers of higher learning, of debate, of the great humanistic traditions of the Western world, of our cherished Enlightenment traditions, were also built, at least partly, upon the violence of the slave trader, the Middle Passage, the auction block, and the whip. We are rightly disturbed by these histories. But if we sit back and think about the broader context, we should not be too surprised that slavery was central to the institutions of higher education as they emerged in North America. After all, for several centuries, North America was part of the great belt of slave plantation economies that stretched from South America through the Caribbean all the way to the borders of New Jersey. Yet here in Boston and here at Harvard, the story of slavery that has been told for all too long is different. New England is hailed in the national memory as a place of freedom, a place where religious dissenters settled on the stony soils of New England to create a new world of liberty and freedom. And thus, if we look at the history of the institutions of higher learning, including the history of Harvard, we have told this history, and they have told these histories about themselves as exactly this story, as a story of the expansion of human freedom, or at least they have done so until recently. When I first embarked upon the project of trying to understand the historical relationship between Harvard University and slavery with my students, the literature on the history of Harvard was almost silent on the question of slavery. And when the students began to uncover a different history, they and others who listened to them were surprised. Yet in retrospect, it seems that the only thing that should surprise us was our surprise. And that it took us so long for us to allow ourselves to be surprised by that history. After all, a whole range of studies, many of them quite old, had argued for the continental reach and importance of slavery. People such as Eric Williams and W.E.B. Du Bois and Ronald Bailey, among many others, had powerfully argued for the nationwide or even global reach of slavery, and it would have been unlikely that the oldest university in North America would not in some ways be also involved in that story of slavery as well. In dusty archival records, countless published volumes in the libraries, and by careful study of Harvard's oldest buildings and neighboring colonial graveyards, students uncovered many links between Harvard and slavery. They chronicled how Harvard presidents brought enslaved workers to live with them on campus. They analyzed how significant gifts to the university were drawn from the exploitation of slave labor. They found evidence for some of Harvard's endowment invested in merchant voyages related to the slave economy. They showed how Harvard's administration favored the suppression of public debates on slavery, fearing a backlash from the local Boston elite. Harvard-trained judges condemned an enslaved woman, as we just heard, to be burned on the stake just a few hundred yards away from here. The students charted how the sons of Southern slave owners who returned after college to a lifetime of violent mastery over their workers mingled on campus with the sons of the Northern elites, forging networks that often lasted a lifetime. The students traced the history of an Antiguan planter who became a major funder of the Harvard Law School. More generally, the students show how the deep immersion of Boston's merchant community with the plantation economy of the Caribbean yielded resources for the university. They analyzed how Harvard acquired one of Cuba's largest sugar plantations, a plantation whose owner, Ed Atkins, provided resources for the university to draw on, and these resources were derived from the labor of his enslaved workers. And students were also able to show how the development of some of the most viciously racist ideas were spearheaded by the members of the Harvard faculty. Indeed, what the students found was that Harvard's connection to slavery extended beyond the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts in the 1780s, and it even extended beyond the abolition of slavery in the United States in 1865. In the process of doing this research, students have made a larger point. They have shown that the history of slavery is the history of the nation as a whole. Even in acknowledging the crimes of slavery, we have all too often settled into a seemingly comfortable fiction that slavery was a regional institution, confined by the 19th century to the states of the American South, with Northerners principally involved with slavery by bringing about its abolition. Slavery, in fact, appears as limited in scope, an unfortunate detour on the nation's march to modernity, and certainly not as one of the engines of America's economy. But as the students have shown, slavery was not a regional institution or a regional problem. Slavery was everywhere, in the merchant houses of Boston, the banks of New York, the factories of Rhode Island, and the universities throughout New England. Such recognition of the continent-spanning importance of slavery in turn also gives a much greater appreciation for those Americans who had the courage and the resolve to stand up against slavery, among them members of the Harvard community, and for those Americans who would die in battle during the Civil War to bring about emancipation, among them also members of the Harvard community. Recognizing the power of slavery, including the power of slavery at Harvard, does put into much sharper relief the courage and dedication of those, black and white, who fought against slavery. They stood against some of the most powerful interests of their own times. As historians and as members of this community, our first commitment is to uncovering the historical truth. Part of that truth is the deep entanglement of this institution with slavery and also with some of the racism, exploitation, and repression that descended upon African Americans after slavery. This history is inscribed in this institution, and it is also inscribed in the nation as a whole. The economic, cultural, ideological, and political legacy of slavery and its aftermath is with us today. It is not just history. It is our present. Slavery is our present. As members of this university, And as members of our national community, we need to confront these histories. We cannot successfully move forward as a university, as a nation, or as citizens without acknowledging this history and making it important to the understanding of our present. And to be meaningful, that acknowledgement will have to have economic and political consequences. It cannot be purely symbolic or rhetorical. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much again for the introductions. My presentation today has two parts. First, I will quickly introduce myself and my association with the Harvard and Slavery Project. And second, I will take you through an example of some scholarship on Harvard and slavery, which is the findings of my senior thesis entitled Plantation University, Harvard Scientists at Soledad Plantation and Cuba's Transition from Slavery to Free Labor, 1880 to 1920. And as my presentation will go on, and looking at this thesis several years later, I realized 1920 is actually not a great time to cut this off. The connection actually extends much further than that. So to start, my name is Alexandra Rahman, and I'm currently a doctoral student at Harvard Business School studying accounting, management, and corporate accountability. I got involved in this field when I took Professor Beckert's Harvard and Slavery Research Seminar when I was a freshman at Harvard College in 2009. I was interested in this class because I had heard of historians discovering other links between slavery and universities at our peer schools like Brown, and I was curious to see if we at Harvard had similar ties to the history of slavery that we simply didn't know about. My research focused on a research facility that Harvard maintained on a sugar plantation named Soledad in Cuba in the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. That facility, called the Harvard Botanic Station, was created by the two figures that you can see here on this slide. Edwin Atkins, to the left, was a prominent Boston businessman, West Indian sugar merchant, and slave owner who purchased Soledad Plantation in 1884. Oakes Ames, to the right, was a Harvard professor of botany. In the aftermath of Cuban slave emancipation in 1886, Atkins wished to apply the latest scientific knowledge in agricultural engineering to boost production at Soledad Plantation. In 1899, he collaborated with Professor Ames to develop the Harvard Botanic Station at Soledad to conduct research on sugarcane to support his business. This relationship, I argue in my thesis, would forge a profitable but problematic link between the history of Harvard and the history of Caribbean slavery. My thesis makes three main arguments. First, it contends that by accepting gifts from Edwin Atkins in the early 20th century, Harvard used wealth and land accumulated by slave labor as scholarly resources. This follows from evidence that Atkins's family wealth was dependent on the West Indian slave economy. Second, it argues that the social and business ties between Atkins and Harvard personnel resulted in significant financial donations to the institution, which drew on the Atkins family fortune. Lastly, and perhaps most important, it asserts that Edwin Atkins's construction of the Harvard Botanic Station at Soledad provided a significant gift to the university's academic assets. I'll begin by just providing a short background on the sources of Edwin Atkins's personal wealth, which he later used to finance Harvard researchers. During the 19th century, the Atkins family, based in Belmont, Massachusetts, rose to riches by trading goods manufactured by slaves, mainly sugar and molasses, in the West Indies. When Edwin Atkins took over the family business, he assumed ownership of the Soledad Sugar Plantation, a 900-acre refinery with approximately 177 slaves. Cuban slave emancipation in 1886, as I mentioned previously, coincided with a period of major innovations in industrial production technology, which also included agricultural engineering. Other innovations such as steam-powered refineries, rail transport, and cable communication all transformed the sugar production business just as the country was beginning to shift from slave labor to free labor. Atkins, eager to keep up with his competitors, invested heavily in new production technologies and approached Harvard professor Ames precisely to help his business successfully navigate this transition from slave production to mechanized production. Drawing on his Cuban fortune, Atkins made significant donations of cash, scholarships, and academic resources to Harvard from 1899 to 1925, enabling students and professors to conduct research on improving the quality and yield of tropical plants such as sugarcane. His largest single donation, which was $17,119 in 1919, was to establish the Atkins Fund for Tropical Research in Economic Botany. This gift would be worth a little over $500,000 today. Physical research spaces like the Harvard Botanic Station help transport intellectual power from the halls of academia and apply it directly to issues on the plantation. Ames and Atkins' partnership culminated in 1925 when they constructed the official Harvard House, a boarding house with bedrooms and a laboratory space for Harvard students to conduct research at the plantation under the management of the university. And what you see here is an image from the inside of one of those labs in 1930 on the plantation. In recognition of Atkins' long and profitable patronage, Harvard President Charles Eliot even awarded Atkins an honorary degree at the 1903 commencement. So although slavery ended in 1886, the physical, cultural, and ideological legacy of slavery remained palpable to Harvard scholars as they continued to conduct research at Soledad. To emphasize this point, I've included a quote from a letter that Professor Ames wrote on one of his research visits to the plantation. He writes, "The slave bell on the plantation rang out one single, musical, but dull note, and I really felt that all the cruelty of slavery was summoned in that one bell tone. My subsequent thoughts were perhaps similar to those of some compassionate creature who suddenly awakened in days gone by to the atrocities of holding in bondage one's fellow man and driving him to and from his work by the note of a doleful bell, aided by the stinging lash which injures one far deeper than steel or bronze." And I should add, I didn't include the rest of the letter on this slide, but it's interesting that he doesn't actually go on to address that this is a problem. He goes on to talk about how this is a issue that people must have faced a long time ago, and isn't antiquity fascinating? This was written like about 20 years after the end of slavery, and he was working for the slave owner who perpetrated these crimes. So just interesting. I know we had talked earlier about people back then maybe didn't realize it was a bad thing. This is an example of someone recognizing it and willfully ignoring it. So despite these mixed feelings, apparently, about working at Soledad, Ames visited his facilities in Cuba often, bringing back data to supplement his science classes at Harvard. Students and instructors continued to use the site for decades to come, leaving behind a trail of photographs, sketches, and Crimson articles documenting their time at the plantation. The university maintained control of the research facilities until travel became difficult during the communist Cuban Revolution, and the last director of the Harvard station left the island in 1961. So to summarize, my thesis argued that Atkins' donations of funds and academic resources sprang from wealth and lands directly dependent on profits from trading West Indian slave products and eventually owning Soledad Plantation. Harvard benefited from the Atkins' fortune by accepting financial and educational gifts and operating Ames's very own Harvard Botanic Station for over half a century on the very grounds of Soledad Plantation. The images on this slide illustrate Harvard professors harvesting papayas on the station in 1924, as well as an image of a sign bearing Harvard's name that was found at the plantation in 2005. In conclusion, I believe these findings demonstrate the importance of investigating connections between Harvard and slavery. I hope that this research will allow us to better understand and recognize how the history of slavery has contributed to the development of our school's vast educational resources, which we still enjoy today. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm Dan Coquillette, and I'm the, along with my distinguished colleague Bruce Kimball, co-director of the Harvard Law School History Project and co-author of a new book on the battlefield of merit, which is the first of 2 volumes, a new critical history of Harvard Law School. Just tell you, those 2 volumes, those are not books that you can't put down. Those are books you can't pick up. But otherwise, perfect gift for your Uncle Ralph. I mean, the Harvard Law School History Project sounds very fancy. But in fact, it's right along the lines of what Sven and Alexandra have been doing. We're a group of volunteers. We did get some grant funding up front, but we're not official. We're people that work together. We meet every month. And it consists of PhDs, JDs, and particularly students working with us and specialist librarians to undertake a whole series of research initiatives. We've done 100 oral histories, not just of faculty, but also of staff and also of students and alumni. And so this is we believe that thanks to this project, Harvard Law School is one of the best documented of all institutions of higher learning in the United States. Now you may ask, well, why is that important? I have to be very sensitive here and not arrogant. We have neighbors to the south in New Haven that are overly sensitive about their law school, and even though it's younger and much smaller. But the truth is, for good or bad, Harvard Law School is the most powerful law school historically in America, and it remains. Just count the Supreme Court justices. It remains the most powerful. That wasn't arrogant, was it? No, just facts, just facts. Now, we knew that on the battlefield of merit was going to be controversial. I mean, we knew. And the things that we were prepared for was first the research on the Civil War. Harvard Law School was next only to West Point, the leading source of military officers for the Confederacy. 13 major generals, 60 colonels of Southern regiments. Almost as many Harvard Law School students died fighting for slavery as died fighting against slavery. And that was because during the entire period of the 1840s and 1850s, Joseph Story, Simon Greenleaf recruited to make a national law school by recruiting in Georgia, Atlanta, in Atlanta and in Savannah and Charleston. So we knew about that. We also knew that Christopher Columbus Langdale and his disciples were fervently anti-feminist. We knew that they had instilled a gender apartheid system at the school, which lasted until 1950. No women were admitted at Harvard Law School until 1950. I've talked to many in the first class. No women on the faculty until 1971, and I've talked to all of them. So this is, there's plenty of controversy there. But what really got the students excited, and in retrospect, I should have seen this coming, is the establishment of Harvard Law School as a foundation based on slavery. There's no doubt about it. We knew early on that Isaac Royall, this is a portrait of him at age 24, with his wife and sister-in-law and daughters. He was a slave owner. We knew that he had 24 slaves in Medford. What we did not know was that Royall's fortune was based on the Antiguan sugar plantations. The cruelty of those plantations were beyond belief. He owned 180 slaves with his father on Antigua in the Pope's Head region. Sugar slavery was very cruel. They issued the slaves knives, the enslaved people knives. Every morning they had numbers on them because you had to turn the knives in every night, and they were razor sharp. a single nick without antibiotic, and death was almost inevitable. The casualty rate on these plantations was extremely high. The only reason why Harvard Law School is going to have its bicentennial and is going to be the oldest law school in America is because the fortune that Royal made in Antiguan sugar was left in a bequest in 1788 to Harvard to establish a law professor. The Royal Professorship is one of the oldest chairs at Harvard. It's occupied right now with great distinction by Janet Halley, who in her inauguration gave tribute to the slaves on which the chair is based. But you know, as we got into this, it got worse. There was a major slave revolt on the Royal plantation. The revolt was under a leadership of a man, very brave man, named King Court. Unfortunately for them, it was betrayed just at the last moment. There are only 27 white men on the island capable of carrying a gun. One was Isaac Royal. There were 364 slaves, but white men had the guns. The uprising was betrayed. It was suppressed. And as a result, 77 enslaved people were burned at the stake by Royal and his friends. The 6 leaders were drawn and quartered, and King Court was gibbeted alive. This gentleman here who founded the Harvard Law School's chair, which became the center of the new school, as one of his descendants said, I know he was a slave owner. I hope he was a nice slave owner. And he wasn't a nice slave owner. He was a brutal slave owner. Here's his house in Medford. It's right, 20 minutes drive from here. Now that's the slave block. The reason why he came to Medford was because of fear of yellow fever, but also fear of another slave revolt. He brought about 20 slaves with him. They lived in this block. Some of us have already been there. You can visit it. But this was his household slaves. You don't get a sense of the cruelty of the industrial slavery by looking at these quarters. It was what was going on in Antigua which was continuing to support his family. That was really, really brutal. He fled to England on the outbreak of the American Revolution, the Battle of Lexington, left his family in Medford. He ran immediately to Halifax. When I introduce the students coming in, I show them the portrait we've just seen. I say, brutal slave owner, traitor, coward. Other than that, a perfect role model for you. In 1936, Abbot Lawrence Lowell, who was an Anglophile of the first order, decided that Oxford colleges all had coats of arms, so therefore residence houses and schools at Harvard all ought to have coats of arms too. And so for the tercentenary, he decreed coats of arms for everybody. That included Radcliffe, but it also included the law school. And the genius who was assigned the law school decided that the right coat of arms should be Isaac Royal's coat of arms. So there is the bookplate of Isaac Royal of Antigua. You see the 3 wheat sheaves. And there is the coat of arms of Harvard Law School until last year. They're identical. Well, anyway, the students who had worked on this research project persuaded other students to read the book. And before anybody knew it, they'd organized Students for Inclusion. Their motto was, "Royal must fall." And they took over the major lounge at the new Casperson Student Center, declared it the Belinda Lounge, which is after the slave, one of Royal slaves, and occupied it. So they were in absolute seriousness. And a committee was formed under the chairmanship of Bruce Mann, and that committee, after a lot of deliberation, decided to recommend to the President and Corporation that the shield be revoked. Now, that decision came with what I think is one of the most eloquent pieces of writing I've ever seen, and it's by our moderator, Annette Gordon-Reed. And in that, she warned that by just eliminating a symbol, you don't eliminate the truth of the past, and also worried that this would cut the school off from the debt it owes to Antigua. By the way, this is what the students thought of the royal coat of arms, right? Yeah, that's their view of it. Yeah. Well, anyway, here I am down on Antigua. That's the Betty's Hope. You can see the great mills for breaking up the sugar cane. I was down there talking to leaders in the Antiguan community, educational leaders, and the head of their national government and their Secretary of Education. And I was talking about, the consciousness of the island and its connection with Harvard Law School. First of all, it turns out that the curriculum in the high schools all mention Isaac Royal and mention the slave revolt. So every high school student on Antigua learns the story. And secondly, that they're absolutely mindful of the connection between the island and this university. At one point, when talking to Michelle Henry, the president of the National Museum, I really was just overcome. I mean, it showed me some things which they just don't normally show tourists, of course, which is this holding pens for the slaves that have survived, and the dungeons where they hung the slaves by their wrists, which are back in the jungle. And I was overcome, and I said, well, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that I represent here and have benefited from an institution that has exploited the enslaved people of this island. I'm just sorry. She turned to me, Michelle Henry, and she said, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. We Antiguans are proud to have had some role in the founding of an institution that would graduate Barack Obama. Now that is generousness. Here you are. There's the poster. They're selling Obama T-shirts everywhere on the island. Now my point is just a simple one, which is Annette Gordon-Reed's dissent stands for a very important truth. You don't go around erasing this and that and pretend things didn't happen. There are pros and cons about the shield controversy, but one thing, we must not forget that Harvard Law School is linked with slavery, that Harvard Law School owes great debt to the enslaved people of Antigua, and that it's part of this great university, that it is so great that it can recognize in itself the truth, veritas. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very honored, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks Radcliffe, and thanks President Faust for the invitation. I want to tell you that this talk is related to Harvard, but may not be related to Harvard. And I'd like to see how we all come to terms with the fact that I'm not a historian. I have to come to terms with that, somehow. But there will be lots of images. I will not describe them. So there's a lecture or the kind of a concept in the images, and there's a concept in the words that I do, and I would like to invite you to think about your own memories when you look at this work. This originated when I was a student at Harvard, kind of the notion of architecture and memory. I was very interested in that as a research, my own personal research, and that kind of continued. So as an architect and a teacher, I've been investigating through design and design pedagogy the relations between space and memory, between architecture and memory. I'm interested in the notion that memory is an action, Memory is not an object, memory is a verb, not a noun. As an action, to remember is to be present, is to say, here we are, to be present in our complex present as academics, as architects, as historians, as intellectuals, as public intellectuals, demands a louder and fearless truth speaking and truth seeking about our past, and also about ongoing plights against humanity, such as human trafficking, genocides, present-day slavery, and incarceration as well. So few words have been so ubiquitous in contemporary culture as the word memory, impacting historiography, psychoanalysis, visual arts, performing arts, poetry, media, landscapes, architecture, public space. So as a result, architects and artists find themselves playing an important role in what we could call public discourses about history and memory. Architecture is inherently a practical and public art. It is a practical art insofar the purpose is the driving force, why a work is called into being. I hope it's not mine. No, it's not mine. Okay, thank you. So let me recap. So it's a practical art insofar that purpose is the driving force, why a work is called into being. It is a public art in that the presence of the work constructs the space for public appearance, in the terms that Hannah Arendt described it. The space for public appearance. So historically, the architect's role has been to create a theater for action and of memory, and we can think that landscapes and buildings, while becoming catalysts for the process of memory, serve to frame human experience. It is in the face of catastrophes, historic traumas, and human injustices that the architects' and artists' public roles become increasingly complex, problematic, and we only hope necessary. We only hope. So how do we position ourselves, when working with these kinds of projects, both as teachers, as architects, as students? Think of this. The word memorial, historic role is to preserve a memory of the past and provide conditions for new responses in the present. This is one of the maps that my students do, dealing with Rhode Island slavery. So think about this point. When we say this is the public space of the city, we usually mean an official monumental space which, using Walter Benjamin's words, is reserved for the celebration of the history of the victors. Memorials and historic landmarks usually celebrate that memory of those who have succeeded at the expense of the forgotten memory of those who have not. It forgets the nameless and the vanquished. According to Hannah Arendt, political equality means visibility. Conversely, political inequality and invisibility go hand in hand. So when we think of institutions of slavery and its legacies, we should look at them through the lenses of spatial practices. Segregation, migration, invisibility, fields, you can think all of the words that we have used, are related to forms of spatial practice. But let's think about this. Democracy, as Claude Lefort tells us, is based on uncertainty and legitimized by the Declaration of Rights. That is the right to declare. Democratic public space is based on contestation, on debate, on the appearance of others. Those others who, as an enigma of a face that resists possession, cannot be fully known and can never be reduced to content, as Emmanuel Levinas, philosopher, would have said. So I think to a large extent, the success of democracy and of public space can be measured in its capacity to encourage and assist in the process of disruption of that history of the victors. We can see this. Hopefully we'll do something. But I'm interested in thinking about these kinds of notions of public space in relation to campuses, in relation to speech. The National Museum, just opened in DC, means much more than a building. Our project in Nantes is more than a riverfront landscape. There are significant reinscriptions, of history and memory in public life. These projects are witnesses to our actions in the present, our actions in the present. So philosophers like Giorgio Agamben have theorized the position of the witness as the basis of an ethical-political relation insofar as the witness answers to the suffering of others without usurping the place of the other. That deals with the history that we were talking about before. Again, the witness answers to the suffering of others without usurping the place of the other. So there's a limit to representation, both in writing, in history, and in speaking. So witnessing is a way of seeing and listening that requires an acceptance of vulnerability. It requires a renunciation of the will to mastery. For as trauma theorist Cathy Carrot argues, To bear witness to the truth of suffering of a traumatic event is to bear witness to that event incomprehensibility. This poses problems for forms of representation, teaching, writing, and creating that attempts to respond to the suffering of others. Perhaps we can only breathe your name. Breathe your name. So aesthetics should be at the service of ethics. This is the attitude that I try to bring to my teaching, to my projects, and to our collaborative work with artist and professor here at GSD, Krzysztof Wodiczko, and involves an approach of art, architecture, and landscape as mediums that are capable of shedding limited set of truth and values in a space that is located between question, publics, and practices. Questions, publics, and practices. So when we dealt with slavery in Rhode Island, the history of slavery in Rhode Island, with a series of design studios that are geared, as pedagogical approach, geared to create conditions for students to encounter stories that they cannot fathom. And I want to thank Jim Campbell for all his fantastic work and his help in setting up these discussions. But these are an attempt to construct and understand history in our present and think of a field of what I call cultural sustainability. Think about how we deal with present conditions. So students work with mapping, students work with coast, students did memory boxes, worked on texts, created, images like this one. This is Linden Place, the Wolf family, mansion in Bristol, Rhode Island, and, kind of a montage of Kara Walker's work. But let's remember, as Jim Campbell also mentioned many times, 55% of the mill workers in Rhode Island by 1830 were children. So we have to think about that. So how do we think about projects dealing with the coast of Rhode Island for today and for tomorrow? This is one of the concepts. These are exercises. I just go very quickly on this. But the point that I'm trying to make is that students can become cultural activists. And interdisciplinary work is what matters in my mind. So let me go quickly, to a couple of minutes on the project for the memorial to the abolition in Nantes that we designed with Krzysztof Wodiczko. And let's remind us that basically today, slavery still exists and does so globally, despite the fact that it's now globally illegal. And it's a question that we have to ask ourselves. And these kinds of approach, this question needs a reinforcement in the consciousness and emotional comprehension of all of us and new generations as well. So Jean-Marc Ayrault, mayor, prime minister, and our kind of direct, sponsor, let's say, of this project, wrote, by building the memorial on the banks of the Loire in the heart of a city, at the point from which the slave trading expeditions departed, we recall that the fact that the struggle for freedom and dignity for all human beings is a fundamental cause inextricably linked to our vision of society. The memorial hopes to become a living place for collective commitment to the memory of the past and to continue our struggle for recognition and promotion of human rights. This is a key point, in public space, in public life, in public speech. How do we deal with our present? So the city has created this kind of parkour that connects the museum to the memorial, and you can see kind of an aerial view of the site, and I'll show you just to give you a sense of scale. This is Radcliffe and this is Harvard. Can you see the map? Just quickly, this is Radcliffe Quad where we are, and this is Massachusetts Hall. This is the scale of the memorial, just to give you a sense of scale. The relation is basically the same distance, twice, because you walk it up above and below. So the concept here is that the city itself has turned its architecture and official public space into a grand reinscription, and I would say disruptive in narrative intervention. They not only accepted this, but embraced this concept, that this space, beyond its symbolic purpose, it's used to commemorate the event and to think about the present. So we excavated, we found an underground space, and we transformed that underground space on the coast of a river, and we transformed it into a place for people to come and read and to think. So the project celebrates the great rupture of abolition with the thrust of a gray slanted plate which emerges to the city and cuts the soil. About 5 centuries of struggle are inscribed in this glass. We also inscribed, kind of as a form of an urban archive, the names of 2,000 expeditions from Nantes that depart from Nantes. And you see people looking at them and walking, and you see beautiful names. You can see La Thérèse. There's a ship called L'Amour. Can you believe that? The Three Marys. Another love, And they are all navires négriers, you know. So I want to sort of invite you to think about the notion that when we walk, we think. When we walk, we evoke. And this is part of what we do. The stones themselves matter. And the place itself only can be done if we really pay not only respect and homage to the people who suffer this story, but actually we pay homage to the people who made this possible, the builders, the people who put their hands and their knowledge into making our buildings possible. This is, to me, what matters when we do buildings, when we do architecture, anywhere we do it. How do we engage with others? And that's an ethical dimension. So cutting the concrete, you know, going underground and transforming this, which is kind of flooding with the water, you know, daily, into a place that can be inhabited, creating a dam underground, a complete structure. This space is about 150 meters below ground. That's a football field and a half length. You know, and you see how it goes and how it moves, and I'm just getting close to the finish. So you see how this glass transforms the ground of a city. And very significant moments of opening of the memorial. And I want to pay significant homage to Madame Christiane Taubira, who's here and will speak later, for her work, not only to support the memorial and her speech at the opening of the memorial, but her work specifically to bring justice, you know, to bring the law that is under your name to the public eye in France and in the world. So that law is inscribed in the memorial, or a portion of the law is inscribed in the memorial, in a space that looks at the Palace of Justice. So we have people visiting, we have people reading, we have people inhabiting a space that relates to the water. A water that perhaps is the only witness, somehow, to this story. A water that filters, a water that comes down through the glass, a water that marks words, you know, words like freedom, and you see people coming, you see groups and schools reading and writing and thinking and discussing. And yes, these are my two kids. And, you know, and basically, and we have Martin Luther King that is also inscribed there, and you see emotion that happened, and you see also revolt. A moment 2 years ago when Angela Davis was visiting the memorial as, you know, a kind of the day of remembrance of the abolition of slavery. So I'm going to finish with just one word, which is this. When we did this project, we didn't know the outcome. I mean, we knew that space matters, you know, and space and memory are totally connected. So when you look at the memorial from the Palace of Justice, you see a line, a horizontal line on the ground of the city. But when you go to the memorial, you see justice. You imagine justice, or perhaps justice that needs to be done. There's no inscription that says, think about justice. But you do that because we can kind of constructed that relation, that dialogue. And that dialogue happens in space, and that dialogue happens when I saw this woman visibly emotional, looking at the memorial and visiting the memorial, and heard footsteps running. And I saw her son, and I saw this embrace. And I want to close by saying, using Levina's citation of Dostoevsky, who also was interestingly connected to James Baldwin's understanding of memory, as far as I read. So Dostoevsky says, all of us are responsible of everything, of everyone before everyone, and myself more than others. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is a time for us to ask one another any questions that we may have about the presentation, or discuss amongst ourselves. Anyone have anything, or do we want to go? Yes, we could go. Well, I just, you know, if you know questions of ourselves. Questions from the audience. They're supposed to be bringing us cards. Sure. What is the response? Do you have any, Julian, did you have any opposition to the I mean, what was the order, what was the nature of it, and what was the strength of it? And who did it come from, if there was anyone who objects to this idea?
Well, there was strong opposition, you know, and if it was not for the support of the mayor, Jean-Marc Ayrault, this project would have not been built.
What did they say? I mean, what
well,
exactly?
they said we don't want the city to feel the guilt, you know, of its own history, you know, being the largest premier slave trading port in France. that basically grew economically through the trade, and that the sugar, that came to Nantes. So one of the things was kind of public guilt. What do we do with public guilt? And the argument that was made was more like recognition. And the mayor was extremely supportive of that. That's one thing. Second thing is that there was a history before the memorial, which was the Les Anneaux de la Mémoire, a very significant exhibition that happened in 1992 that had about 500,000 people visiting the Château de Nantes, the Duc de Bretagne, basically to visit and to understand the history of its own city. So it seems to me that there's some aspects of the story that, were extremely important in the public eye. The people who did not want this to happen came from either families or more, I would say, right wing kind of areas of the people in the city. But once the memorial opened, it was embraced. Once the memorial opened, it was embraced by the people and visited, and everybody brings family to visit the memorial, and they see this as a unique project, both in the city and in France. And I think I'm personally very moved to have been simply be able to visualize this, to visualize this project, and to inhabit that space that nobody has ever seen before we opened it. There's a space that was excavated that no one has ever seen before, because it was just simply residue of construction of the ports.
Dan, for the people in Antigua, have you heard any response to them about the shield, or can you sort of predict what they might say about it?
Well, they are aware of the decision, and they have copy of the opinion and of your dissent. So these are people who, really keeping track here. There's no question that they're not interested in reparation or anything like that. That's not what interests them. What interests them is some recognition by this great university that we owe them a debt, an historic debt. And there are many possible ways. They don't have enough. When I was down there were lines to use laptop computers in the library. There are not enough computers. There's also not enough fresh water. And they're having problems with their justice system. So, there's so many things we could do to help.
I think I should probably say what happened with the dissent, what my rationale was. This whole question, a lot of it comes from, I think the Royal Must Fall was influenced by the movement at Oxford about Oriel College. Rhodes Must Fall. There's a statue of Cecil Rhodes on top of Oriel College that I've been into and a number of times and never knew he was up there. He's up pretty high. And the thinking was that this was an affront, and there was a student movement on those lines. On our committee, we were talking about the best way to proceed, and it's not that I think that it would be a matter of erasing history just by moving the shield. The idea I had was that, and I talked in the dissent about the difference between a representation of a person who can't be reconstituted, someone like Cecil Rhodes or John Calhoun, a flag like the Confederate flag that has a history and a past and is so imbued with a spirit that you can't, to my mind, do away with what that meant in terms of the Confederacy or what it meant in its modern incarnation with people taking it and using it to oppose civil rights, and when it's hauled out and why it's hauled out. It's not like that. The 3 bushels of wheat are symbols. When my husband and I were here as students, we had no idea what it meant. I thought, well, okay, if sheaves of wheat, fertility, knowledge, what is this? We really didn't know, and we had wheat pennies, but wheat is a symbol of abundance and so forth. So we sort of think abundance of wisdom or something like that. You give it a name, so it could mean anything. And it struck me that since we were having our centennial, what we could do would be to have a ceremony and reconstitute the law school and the sheaves of wheat to be in honor of the people whose labor gave Isaac Royal the money to build the law school. it's the power of law, what we do, is transformative. We could make the symbol about whatever we want it to be about. And my fear, and to have that powerful symbol there go across the world every time Harvard Law School went anywhere, I thought would be powerful, that the people on the Royal Plantation would be remembered, and they would be remembered in a way that would be living and would go forward. It's nice to have a display in the law school and the special collections and talk about it amongst ourselves when students come, but it would be different to have Harvard Law School linked. Harvard Law School that under, I think, the modern aegis of Harvard Law School, when the shield was actually used more, Harvard has a tradition, law school has a tradition of public service. Many people were involved in civil rights. That legacy could be linked to the old legacy to make something new. We're not bound by the past in that way. So that was my thinking. It's not from any love or respect of Isaac Royal, but the Royal Plantation was not about Isaac Royal. To me, the Royal Plantation was about the enslaved people who lived there. And that is the story. And we could make the story what we wanted it to be, rather than being hostage to Isaac Royal and his family. So that was my thinking. Ceremony, reconstitute it, we go forward with a different, perhaps add the word, justice for justice to the shield and make that association complete. So that's what my thinking was. It was not out of, is it royal? Great.
Can I just quick? Sure. I just quickly wanted to add a few things. I mean, for one, I think what is really important is that whatever we do, that we don't take the steps that we're taking as a kind of an effort to end the conversation or to end our engagement with this history, but really that we commit ourselves to a continued conversation of this history and a continued confrontation with this history. And I think the worst thing we could do is kind of to cleanse our institutions from this history and then to say, oh, we took care of that and now we don't have to worry about it anymore. No, I think we need to continue to engage with this. And then I thought maybe the experience of the city of Nantes in some ways is actually quite relevant to our situation here, because obviously Nantes is not a city that was itself the site of mass enslavement. It is not a city that was characterized by slave plantations. And it is a city in which presumably, though I don't know that for a fact, but in which presumably many people don't really know anymore that it had this the very significant link to the slave trade and to Caribbean slavery. And that is, I think, quite similar to the situation we're facing here at Harvard. And so it would, I think, actually be quite interesting to learn, for us to learn from the Nantes experience, to see how you can, how you can memorialize this history on the one hand, but also how you can encourage a continued conversation on that history, and how you, as Julian mentioned, how you can persuade people who are reluctant to engage in this debate to eventually persuade them to actually to engage these kinds of issues. I think there is a lesson in it for us, though I don't know exactly what that lesson is.
Well, one of the things that's happening at the law school now, we're going to be encouraging people to do that, since we have the Royal Plantation not very far, is, and Janet Halley is doing this, encouraging people to visit. I've been there. And they do a great interpretation, very illuminating interpretation about slavery in New England and the lives of the people there. Maybe obviously have our students go there. I would like to, as part of what I thought would go on after a perhaps reconstituted shield and rededication, we would have more of a connection to the people of Antigua. Maybe students, some connection there to keep the thing going, instead of just letting it go. But that any kind of experiences from other places should help inform us. Here's a question for you, Professor Beckert. Thank you for your presentation and ongoing commitment to justice for enslaved Africans' descendants. You said the solution must be economic and not just rhetorical or symbolic. Do you support reparations to specific organizations who build African self-determination? I'm sorry for, I'm putting you on the spot, but.
Okay, no, that's just fair, because I ended my talk exactly on this notion, and obviously that was also very much the subject of our conversations this morning. And yes, as I said, I think it is important to acknowledge this history. It is important to know what that history is. and we have made some progress in this in this process. But I think we also need to very much keep in mind what was being said today. This is a history that is about massive violence. This is a history of racism, and this is also a history of massive dispossession, as was also mentioned earlier today. And all of the violence, the racism, and the dispossession is not just of relevance to understanding the past, but it's also very much of relevance to understanding the present. And in that way, I think there is a material dimension to this issue, and there is a need for institutions or perhaps nations who have greatly benefited from exploitation, racism, enslavement, and dispossession. There is a responsibility to address these past injustices and also address them in material terms. What this exactly looks like, I can't tell. But I think the importance is to acknowledge this and then to have a conversation among a community, for example, a university community, to see what the proper steps are that should be taken.
Mm-hmm. Julian, and I thought this myself, what would a memorial to slavery at Harvard look like? And how do you garner your support?
And how? Sorry?
How do you garner your support? The first one, what would a memorial at slavery at Harvard look like?
I think it's a question that I cannot answer, because in order to conceive or think through such an endeavor, one requires time to think about it. And to me, it's not that I'm trying to sort of shortchange or sort of shy away from the response. It's actually that there may be other ways in which one can think of this. I am personally more interested in the word memory than in the word memorial, even though we have built it. I'm interested in how we think about memory, relation to the past, but memory as remembering. You know, James Baldwin's unfinished book, Remembering This House, you know, sort of the notion of remembering a house. So then the question that I ask myself is, if I can follow up with that, is once we think of this history, we somehow shed light over a portion of the history. You know, imagine a lamp. You know, you don't shed light over the totality of the history of slavery. So some aspects we can see, some aspects we cannot see. But what we can see, we cannot unsee. And this is an important aspect of the question of the lamp of memory. And the question I ask myself is, once we see something, it continues to be with us. So how do we allow that what we see to interrupt our present? Meaning, how can we hear the voices of those who are not present? How can we see these faces, you know, that we see here? But how can we understand that the retrospective projection of meaning, you know, is very complex? So for me, one of the biggest questions I ask myself, and perhaps it's a question for the university, perhaps, is how do we deal with our present conditions? How do we invite our students, interdisciplinary work, to consider the present? You know, both be that mass incarceration, be that sex trafficking or human trafficking today, which are enormous, you know, and quite significant. So if there was a kind of a memorial, I would think of more like an institution that is an ongoing project that never finishes. Because perhaps to repair, and I'm just going to use a Hebrew word, tikkun, is to repair, tikkun olam is to repair the world. And perhaps we're all here trying to do our best to repair what we can. You know, and to me, that's something that I would like to think about. Perhaps the university could engage with. It's a conversation first.
Dan, this was one to you, but I might be able to answer part of this as well. To what extent do you think the legacy of slavery at HLS affected curriculum or sustained the development of legal thought at HLS?
Well, that's a great question. Basically, what happened before the Civil War is a question of memory, with the Confederate leaders and the Union leaders remembering being taught very different things. The Confederate, one of the Confederate leaders was held here in Castle Island, and wrote an irate letter to his law professor, Emory Washburn, saying that he didn't understand why Emory isn't supporting him, because he, after all, was fighting for the states' rights that Emory Washburn taught him in the classroom at Harvard Law School. Washburn sent him a book, by the way, to read. But in all seriousness, one of the things that the Civil War episode at Harvard Law School shows is that there was an effort, a very deliberate effort, by Charles Warren. And I know you're the Charles Warren professor, and I'm the Charles Warren visiting professor, but the first history of Harvard Law School was a 3-volume history, only 1 century, written by Charles Warren. Charles Warren essentially took the Civil War out of the history of the school. And he did it very deliberately, because at that point the school was reaching out to its Southern alumni and bringing in the former Confederate officers who survived and the former Confederate leaders. There were 27 in Jefferson Davis's government. They were now becoming leaders of the anti-Reconstruction. They were becoming mayors of Atlanta, governors of South Carolina, and they were being welcomed back into the fold at Harvard Law School. Now, to do that, you need to redefine what the Civil War was about. And one of the things that we have been able to ascertain through the letters and notes of the students is that everyone thought that the war was about slavery when the war was being fought. So it was slavery that drove the Union students to volunteer. It was slavery that was that caused the fights that went into Harvard Square. They emptied the classroom fighting each other. It was slavery. Suddenly, after the war is over, it becomes convenient to redefine the war about something else. States' rights, theories of constitutionality. Now we've resolved it, so we can move on. And let's forget about segregation. Let's forget about racism. And I'm afraid that in my mind, one of the worst chapters of the history of the school was the 20 years under Langdell, when Langdell essentially wrote out racism and civil rights from the curriculum of the school.
Here's a question for both of us, I guess. What are the next steps at the law school beyond the new seal? Well, okay, all right. I'm the moderator. I'm not supposed to. Well, there's still a lot of student interest in bringing about a more inclusive curriculum, as they describe it. There are discussions about that. Discussions about a diversity of professors in terms of the way they teach, the kinds of subjects, bringing race more into discussions. Very often, in a contracts case, or just to make an example, or civil procedure, other things, there's a surface, what the issues are, there are surface issues involved, but there are racial aspects of it that students would like to be brought into the mix. It's sort of difficult. There's some thinking it's difficult to talk about race in classes. Some people are uncomfortable doing that. I teach criminal procedure, which race obviously is all shot throughout the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence and the actual jurisprudence, but the actual practice of policing. So it's not a difficult thing in my subject area, but there's a much more talk about pedagogy, how to raise these kinds of issues. There's a lot of things going on. I think the Shield controversy sort of came and went, but the continuing discussion about transformation of law school is very much there. And do you have any thoughts any more about what you're seeing?
Well, I agree with all of what you just said. I mean, the students yearn for context. It's one thing, what we have gotten from Langdell is a formal curriculum that's still remarkably the same as it was in the 1880s. And the legal formalism stripped context from the life of the law. And I think the students yearn to have it brought back, and many of our colleagues are working hard on this, this issue to make the legal doctrines contextualized. I also think that the representation on the faculty is important. We're approaching 20% Asian American enrollment. At the moment, there's only one tenured Asian American faculty out of 91 or 92. You know, and I think that the students want a faculty that they can identify with, that are their role models. And that involves gender, but involves, you know, ethnicity and race as well.
I mean, I will say one word for formalism. I mean, part of the answer to that is that there's a concern on the pushback on sort of changing curriculum or doing things too differently, is that there's a benefit, at least first year, to focusing on analysis, focusing on law, understanding law as it exists, and certainly context is always going to be important there, but you don't want, I mean, I'm channeling other people, you do not want a strictly politics class where people get to talk about current events or whatever, and that's the fear that you go too far. And so what we're trying to do has been to balance the sort of the case method and the Socratic method to accommodate new understandings and different perspectives on things. And a lot of people want to do it. We have faculty workshops talking about how to teach difficult courses, State v. Mann, a very famous case involving in slavery. How do we talk about these kinds of things? And cautionary notes about it's difficult because there might be some students who are upset about that. The difficulty is there's no one viewpoint about all of these things. One of the critiques of this notion of my idea of having the shield as something that is sort of a living symbol is that some people don't want to be reminded of that. And why should African Americans be reminded of that? And I have a different perspective on that, but there is no one viewpoint. And you have to consider all of them and try to come to some sort of balance. So it's an interesting time. I mean, it's challenging, but that's what we're here for, to solve problems. That's what the law school is about, and I think we're going to rise to that challenge. Did you have something? Alexandra, if you may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to make like a quick comment just from a student perspective. I'm now a student at Harvard for the second time in my life and consider myself very lucky to be one. But I do think there is a desire from students as well to have kind of like a mission-driven education. Like you go to Harvard and there's this emphasis on how do you use your education to be good, to better society. And I think sometimes when you move from the college to the professional schools, that like mission-driven sense gets a little bit lost. Mm-hmm. And so maybe like one practical way would be at our professional schools to kind of emphasize that our professional schools are also mission-driven, right? Like being at the business school, you should have a sense of going out there and using your education to better society. So maybe that's another like actionable.
Yeah, I would say for the law school, from the time I was there, it's public service has been at the heart of it. We have time for one more comment.
Can I make one just quick comment on this issue? When you asked me about, what would the memorial look like? Sort of a bit caught off guard, but the
you thought of something.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that. But the concept that I'd like to share with you is this. I just took a cursory research at the Harvard series of schools in terms of their work that they are doing with questions of present-day slavery. And there are many initiatives happening today at the School of Health, the Kennedy School of Government, the Harvard Law Review, and you can keep going. And this is happening as well in the world. There are many initiatives happening. So going to the question of mission-driven, would it be possible to conceive that this institution may help frame a new 21st century abolitionism movement or abolitionist movement, help contribute to that? What would it look like? I have no idea. Why? Well, there are a lot of people today in conditions that are illegal, but they are still slavery. So the question to me is not only the past. Yes, the past, of course. We need to keep working at it. But how do we deal with our present conditions? And that will help better society today, just as an offer.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.